To Thursday, our second to last broadcast of virtual APUSH. Ms. Farr and I are here today to talk to you about the question that we worked on yesterday. So before we get started though, I wanted to give a quick shout out. Had a very nice phone conversation yesterday with a Mrs. Rizzo from Bemis Point High School. From Maple Grove High School in Bemis Point, New York. And apparently she and her students watch every day and had a lot of very nice things. So thank you, shout out to all of her students and to that teacher. So
Yes, thank you.
let's roll.
All right. So yesterday, you guys did DBQ practice number 2, and this was your question. To what extent did American society change during the antebellum period? And you were given the time period from 1820 to 1860. So definitely want to keep those dates in mind as you were writing. Hopefully you did. And if you didn't, don't worry about it. We're going to kind of walk you through it and kind of hopefully give you some ideas of things that you could have possibly have gotten from the DBQ as you kind of work through it. All right. So one thing we wanted to kind of remind you guys about is the submission process. We've been seeing a lot of questions about submitting, people wanting to know about taking pictures, should they write, what they should and shouldn't do. So we're just going to kind of walk you guys back through that just to make sure that you understand what the process is. Okay. So. If you decide to copy and paste, that means you type it out and say Word or WordPad or whatever it is that you decide to use. You are welcome to do that. Just make sure if you copy and paste that you have your AP ID and your initials at the top of your response. Definitely want to make sure when that timer gives you that 5 minute that you go ahead and start wrapping things up. I know sometimes you want to get those last minute ideas, but you don't want to mess up or jeopardize any time that it may take. I want you guys to keep in mind, this is an exam that a lot of people are taking at the same time. So it may take a little bit of time for your submission to go through. So you don't want to be one of those people who decides, oh, I can just do it up until the final minute and then copy and paste my response. And then there's a possibility that your response may not make it in time. So definitely want to make sure that you do that. As the screen says, on exam day, have side-by-side setup. So one screen where you're actually typing your response out, and then the other screen is where you're actually looking at the test and you're actually to see all the documents. And then of course, you're going to copy and paste it and submit your answer. All right, Mr. Horton,
Yeah,
do
and
number
we've been
2.
told that you can print the question as well. If you wanted to print the documents quickly and write on them, you could do that as well, have that sort of off to the side. So another way you can do this is to actually save your document on your computer and then attach it. So instead of cutting and pasting or copying and pasting out of your document into the window, the AP exam window, you can actually just attach this as an attachment. So again, make sure that your AP ID and your initials are at the top of it. That's really important to make sure your identity is on there, but it's masked at least a little bit. So lots of different formats to save your document in, as it shows you on the screen here. Most of the typical ones there. So this is a second way to do that, again, on a computer of some kind. So make sure that you have Grammarly shut off on your computer as well. It's a question that my own students were asking yesterday. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And I know somebody had asked this question before. I think a teacher had asked me a question about a student who wanted to use like the header to make sure that they get their AP ID number and all that on there. If you decide to use that, I would recommend just like Mr. Horton said, saving it as a file and then uploading it that way. That way your header is there if you're really unsure if you forgot to type your AP ID number or your initials on there. So at least with the header, you know that it's there. You don't have to worry about copying and pasting. And this point, you just basically save it and then you can upload it that way. All right, and then the last one, I know a lot of people have been asking this one, is handwritten. It is at your discretion if you choose to handwrite. Just remember, I did recommend using a dark blue or black pen. Avoid, if you write on paper front and back, avoid using a Sharpie, because remember, those actually do bleed through, so they can kind of mask some of your answers. And just make sure, again, you might want to give yourself a little bit more than 5 minutes if you're going to handwrite, just to make sure that you get your pictures taken and that you can actually upload them. These are the acceptable formats: JPEG, JPG, PNG. Sometimes you can save your pictures as a file itself instead of a photograph. Sometimes, like, you can save it as a document, and then you can do it as a PDF file, and it should pop up that way. But again, just make sure that you give yourself plenty of time. And if you decide to use a pencil, I would not recommend using a mechanical pencil because sometimes those they won't show up very well in photographs. So just try to use a regular number 2 pencil if you have it. Anything you want to add, Mr. Horton, to this?
Got a quick question here. Yeah, I had a quick question from Twitter. So first, a quick shout out to Mr. Inge, a huge shout out. The student is requesting, but the question was, what if your internet stops working during the AP exam? Which is a great question. If you're unable to submit a response on the May 15th exam time, you're automatically then registered for the late version of the exam. So there is sort of a fail-safe, if you will, for those kind of technical issues. You know, your Wi-Fi goes out, the power goes out in your home, your computer crashes, you know, whatever those issues are. So they've already, the College Board has already figured out a way to deal with that if that does in fact happen. So
awesome. All right, guys, so we're all here to kind of go through this question. So we're going to jump right into it. Oh yeah, forgot about it. Make sure when you submit your response, I know we're blocking it a little bit, but make sure that after you attach it, that you actually click submit. And that is very, very important. And then basically what you want to see after you hit submit, and like I said, it may take a while. If we don't have a 2-part question, thankfully, so you'll have to kind of sit there and wait for it to buffer while it's uploading. And then you want to hear you want to see these words, your AP exam is complete. If you do not ever see that and it takes forever and it just seems like it keeps buffering and you're not sure, don't cut your computer off, just let it run. If it doesn't look like it's still working, then definitely go to cb.org/request makeup and just kind of explain it. It may have uploaded and you may not have to do a makeup. They can probably go and find it and check it just to see if it actually did upload. But the main thing is you definitely want to hit submit. Don't just upload and think, oh, I'm done, and just walk away. You definitely want to make sure you click that submit button. That is the most important part.
And once you do, that's your answer goes in. So you can't change anything after that. So.
All right. So I'm going to disappear for a bit because we're going to walk you guys through that. We noticed that we have been blocking some of the things. So I'm going to stop my video. You can still hear me, but you can, I want you to be able to see what we're talking about. So here we go. All right, so we talked about the question, and so hopefully you guys got that. The question was focusing in on periods 4 and 5, so from 1800 to 1848, and then of course period 5 from 1844 to 1877. So these are some of the things Mr. Horton actually came up with this question. So these are some of the things that he hoped that you would have thought about when you're talking about, you know, changes as far as social changes. And again, this is not everything. These are just some of the things that hopefully you could have popped up in your mind. And remember, making a list, brainstorming is always recommended before you write your essay because sometimes that can kind of help you get your thoughts together.
Yeah.
All right, is there anything additional you think you wanted to add to this list, Mr. Horton, or you think this was a pretty good start?
No, this was my brainstorm list. Like when I first started thinking about writing the question, like, okay, if we're talking about social change in that period, what are the things that come to my mind? So, so this was what my list was. You may have additional things that are on there. You might not have all the things that I have, and that's perfectly fine too. So just a quick response to a question on Twitter. Student asked about what if we don't have time to finish all of our paragraphs, like if we only have time to write 3. Do the best job you can would be my response to that. You know, you might not be able to get 5 paragraphs in, and that's okay. So that's why we're doing these practices, just to give you a little sense of what the pacing and stuff should be. So.
Yeah. All right, so let's start looking at the documents, guys. Oh, yeah, kind of going back through before we look at the documents, kind of talking about the thoughts of contextualization and just kind of making sure that you guys understand that. And I think you guys do. But for this one, remember, we're always looking at the bigger picture. We're always kind of talking about, you know, things that are happening around that time that would have caused some of the, you know, the documents to have been written, or what the purposes, many of the purposes of the documents were for. And so the first question is, what are the bigger picture issues happening? And so we focused in on the economic changes of the period, the market revolution, and then of course the political changes of the period, the era of the common man. So if you joined me when I did Jackson and Democracy, a lot of things should kind of have popped up in your head. Hopefully that you remember from that lecture. Okay, and the second question, I'm gonna let Mr. Horton do.
Yeah, so background is another way to think about contextualization is sort of setting the stage for your answer, for your response. So this question is asking about social change in the period 1820 to 1860. But to understand that question better, or your response better, you probably would want to talk about some things that had changed, social changes prior to 1820. And one of the dangers, I know some of my students often go way back. For example, with the second bullet point there, it says, northern states emancipate their slaves after the American Revolution. So that would be good contextualization for this. But to talk about the beginning of slavery in America in 1619 is really way too far into the past. We're looking for what happened just before this that might help understand the growing divide in the United States over the issue of slavery. Well, the North had been getting rid of slavery prior, just after the Revolution. So these are some of the things that you might be thinking about with social change prior to 1820. Republican motherhood is an idea about women having this responsibility to, patriotic responsibility to raise their sons to be good citizens of the Republic. So again, just another way to think about contextualization is background. And I always recommend that this goes in the first paragraph. It's an easy place to kind of put I'm going to set the stage, here's my argument, and then boom, off you go with your body paragraphs.
Okay, yeah, and I know Andrea said that she was still kind of struggling with the concept of contextualization. Just think about, even though you're looking at one solid event, there's a bigger picture. There's other things that are happening during that time period that is kind of like a culmination. That's what I kind of like to think about when I think of contextualization, like so many different things that are happening at the same time, that while you may be focusing in on the market revolution, you got to think about it, the fact that, the United States, the republic is still building. We have a new president that's in office. Things are kind of happening that way. So that's how you kind of look at it. It's just a bigger picture of all of these things that are happening while simultaneously. Hope that helps.
So yeah,
All
so
right.
thinking about what we're
So
doing with
let's
this,
jump into
the AP lot. Yep. So thinking about what we're doing with the College Board thing, the bigger picture is that all the different courses are doing the YouTube live session of this. So that's the big picture. College Board is making all these different changes to try to make this exam possible for you. Our video at 11 o'clock every day is just a small part of that story. So, where does it fit in the bigger picture of the story? So.
Okay.
Are you still
All
there?
right. So this is, yeah.
Okay.
Hello?
Yep.
All right. So this is your first document that you looked at. This is Charles Grandison Finney. This is called The Revivalist. And if you remember anything about Charles G. Finney, he was a very, very big model inside of the second, can't even get my thoughts together.
Yeah. Second Great Awakening.
There you go. So kind of remembering this document, kind of looking through it. Remember, we talked about HIP and really kind of talking about the analysis part of it. And we're going to kind of talk to you guys about what we got from this document as we kind of went through it. So here are our responses. So again, the historical situation is the Second Great Awakening. And if you remember, around this time, church membership had declined tremendously. People were starting to really kind of turn away from it. And so what they realized is that sometimes if people won't go to the church, you got to bring church to the people. So this is where you're going to start to see a lot of revivals happening. Churches really kind of opening up and really kind of embracing people. The intended audience are individuals who he deemed as sinners that needed to return to the church for salvation. He's kind of talking about, selfishness. He kind of talks about how people can choose Satan or people can choose God. And he's really kind of driving home about the ideas or, the consequences of disobedience at this time. And so he's really kind of not as strong as the First Great Awakening was, where everything was all hellfire and brimstone, and basically everybody's going to go to eternal damnation, that kind of thing. But really kind of talk about if you do this, he gives you the power to disobey or obey, but he also has the power to forgiveness. And so he's really kind of talking about everybody overall and really kind of wanting people to come back to the church and go back to being faithful.
Yeah, so point of view is that people have the option, the choice of being either faithful to God's teaching or to being sinners. And he talks about moral agency, this idea that people, he's trying to convince people to make that decision and to do it, to make the decision to be more in line with what the teachings of God are. And so, you should act to improve your life, and not only your life, but to improve the life of people around you. So the Second Great Awakening launches into, or is really the bedrock of a lot of the reform movements of the period that we're talking about today in the antebellum era. So ideas like perfectionism, which is this notion that man and human society can be made better. Well, the way to do that, of course, is to choose to do that and to act in a more moral way, which is what he's trying to encourage people to do here. So,
Okay. We have a question from Twitter. Wanted to give a shout out to Miss Garcia, Idea Walzem. I'm not sure if that's the name of the school. But they also wanted to know if they could use an outside source from period 6. Remember, you got to be careful with your outside sources. It needs to be applicable. It needs to pretty much kind of stay within the time period. So if it's not talking about period 6, I wouldn't recommend you going into period 6. But basically, because there's such a broad time period, you have ways of drawing in outside sources. Remember, these are documents that you're not given. So that's when we talk about outside sources, that's what we're talking about. Documents that they're not already there that exist. And there's plenty of documents that you will be able to work with in whatever the DBQ topic is going to be about. So don't feel like you have to go backward or forward into a different period like that. You have to stay within that time period. That's important.
yeah.
All right. All right. Document 2 coming up. Andrew Jackson's speech to Congress on the Indian removal. And so automatically you should have kind of already thought about, remember Jackson, how he felt about Native Americans and that kind of thing. So the historical situation is just his open hostility. While it sounds very eloquent in his speech, he was very, very much so openly hostile towards Native Americans. He's always been hostile towards them, even since the War of 1812. And then also, too, this is him basically showing his defiance of the Supreme Court. If you recall, there were some court cases where the Supreme Court actually did rule in favor of the Native Americans, and Jackson just basically said they've given their law, now let them try to enforce it. And so this is him kind of showing that even though he doesn't really care what the Supreme Court says, that he does see them as savages. Whom is he addressing? You will know that this is an address, speech to Congress. However, he's not just talking to Congress. Remember, Jackson was all about the common man, the American people. So he'll kind of tailor his speeches for Congress, but he's also talking to the American people because he knows that it's going to take all of them if they want to get rid of what he deems as a Native American problem.
Okay, great. A couple questions on Twitter. Since there are 3 extra points for the exam, do they act as extra credit points? And the answer to that is absolutely not. The rubric is out of 10 points. They're not extra credit. They are points on the rubric. It's a good question. And then the other was how far before the question should we start with our contextualization? The sort of good rule of thumb is about 20 years, 10 to 20 years, thereabouts, something like that. So would be the answer to that question. And then the third question, will we have time to review the 5 docs before the test? And the answer to that is no. When the timer starts, that's when you get to look at the documents, just like we did the last couple of days. When the timer starts, that's when the documents will be available to you, and you have to use part of your time to review those documents. So just to answer that point of view, what is Jackson talking about here? Getting back to the document, this is Jackson basically saying, listen, removing Indians from land is going to benefit everybody. I mean, Indians are going to benefit from this in his point of view. It's going to separate them from contact with whites. It's going to separate them from conflict with whites. Of course, he's not consulting with the Native Americans when he addresses this, of course, but that's his perspective, that this is the best solution to the problems of battles that happen between whites and Native Americans. And his purpose, of course, is to advocate for his policy of Indian removal, which eventually will result in the Indian Removal Act. So he's talking about the why this is a good thing, and trying to get people to support that whole thing. So again, think about when I looked at this document, putting this together, I thought, well, okay, students, I think, could do a couple things with this. One is to really keep in mind the question, is this a change? How different is this than Indian policy prior to this or later? So something to think about with that as well.
Okay. All right, so document 3 is the Declaration of Sentiments. And very, very good document. Notice how they put he. So clearly you notice that this is probably written from a perspective of a woman, and kind of talking about some things that women kind of felt like were repeated injuries. And of course, it kind of talks about that and very, very strong. And the one thing I did want to mention with the Declaration of Sentiments is that they did take some of the language that Thomas Jefferson had put into the Declaration of Independence to kind of put those focuses in on here to make them kind of with the understanding that women were never a part of what they thought with this new idea of what the new republic will look like. So the historical situation is you should have automatically, hopefully, have thought about the fact that this was the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 that's being led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So this is the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. The intended audience, of course, they're addressing the federal government, but they're addressing lawmakers too. They want to have that acknowledgement that women have long been ignored, that women have played very, very pivotal roles in, the American Revolution, have played their parts in several things. And, women are very, very intelligent. They're not just supposed to take the role of just being a wife and the homemaker and taking care of the children, that they should actually be able to support the federal government in which they help fight for their freedom as well. And so they're kind of talking about the fact that, you guys talked about King George and how a tyrant he was for usurping your rights. Well, you guys are basically doing the same things to us. Are we considered citizens? Are we not, the same people who were fighting right beside you during this time and wanting to help help you guys get this independence? Well, you forgot about us. So now it's time for you to kind of recognize this is where we are and we want our rights as well.
Yeah. And I think they're being very intentional by using the language of the Declaration of Independence, doing that. So the point of view throughout this whole thing, I mean, they're basically suggesting that women have been treated as second-class citizens in a variety of ways. And they talk about that women have never been allowed to exercise their right to the franchise. And of course, that's a word that means the vote. And they talk about in the second bullet point, he has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. So they're referencing the idea of the femme couverte, which you might remember from the colonial era, that women basically disappear under the authority of their husband as far as the law is concerned. Men can take their property from them. Men control the most profitable careers that you can see at the bottom there. So, and then the purpose is to advocate for equality. They're pointing out, as Ms. Fark mentioned, that they're tired of this, that, you left us out, and we certainly don't deserve to be left out, including the right to vote, which is the very first of the bullet points there. So the thing that came to mind for me too with this document is the idea of cult of domesticity, this sort of idea that that women belonged in the home, and that's one of the changes that happens in this period, thanks to the market revolution, the development of that idea. And these women are challenging that. They're suggesting that that idea is treating women in a way that really isn't okay.
Right. And a couple of questions. Somebody asked the question is, could I use the Second Great Awakening as a contextualization, or would that be too broad? Well, the fact that the Second Great Awakening is kind of implied in there with one document, it depends on where you're going with that theory, but that actually wouldn't probably work for contextualization because of the fact that that's already been addressed in the document. Remember, when you're doing contextualization, you're talking about the big picture. So this question is not talking about just the Second Great Awakening. It's talking about multiple things. It's talking about political and it's talking about social things. And you got the political aspect from it when you had the Jackson document and you talked about the Indian Removal Act. And then now you're talking about the Declaration of Sentiments. So now you're talking about women's suffrage. So remember, big picture means something that's bigger, that's kind of going to comprise all of it together. So if I were going to talk about contextualization and kind of using these periods, then you can kind of talk about reform movements that were happening overall during this period and how this is kind of a period of change, if that kind of makes sense for you. But
Yeah.
if it's something that's already addressed in a document, no, that cannot be used for contextualization at that point, because that's just one aspect of it. Remember, we're talking
Right.
about bigger picture overall.
But if that document wasn't in there, sure, you could use that as part of this, right? So,
Right, definitely.
but
All right,
yeah,
so this,
good point about if it's in the document, probably not. So,
all right. This is a document, and I know you guys probably haven't seen, maybe have not, maybe have seen your fair share of, graphs, but there is the potential for you to have a graph on there. And so the one thing we definitely want to recommend is that you read the title of the graph, because a lot of students will not do that. They'll just look at the information and then they'll just kind of start kind of ascertaining something that may not be there in the graph. So just kind of make sure that you read the title of the graph. Don't just read all the information in here. But this is saying voter participation in presidential elections from 1824 to 1928. So again, but you're only seeing, we notice that it says 1824 to 1928, but you notice that we only gave you a select amount. So that's going to be important as well. All right, so your historical situation here is we're looking at the fact that voter participation increased, especially during the age of Jackson. You'll kind of notice that with the election of 1824. That should definitely kind of put into that theory of the politics of the common man, which is what Jackson wanted. Universal male suffrage kind of increased 26.9%, kind of close to 30%. So the intended audience is pretty much voters in America, kind of showing the changing patterns and kind of showing how suffrage is changing, and how before you had to be a wealthy landowner. Now they're kind of changing it, kind of changing the land ownership rules and allowing more and more participation. And so as that participation starts opening up, what you do see is more and more people are actually exercising their right to vote.
yeah, a couple quick shout outs from Twitter. Miss Leanne Sturm from Harding Fine Arts for her wonderful support for preparing us for the upcoming exam. Let's see, where are the other ones here? Thank you to Jan, who wants a huge shout out for Mr. Horton and Ms. Farr, whoever they are. Seriously, though, they said, thank you for these excellent reviews. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you for that. Ms. Mack at Stratford High School. This will make her day, according to this student. I would like a shout out to Mr. Marson at Penfield High School. Penfield actually isn't all that far from Seneca Falls. I'm thinking about that last question. So, shout out to those folks, and thank you for the shout out to Ms. Farr and I. So, the point of view, graphs don't really have a point of view, right? So we're not looking at this from the perspective of you really can't use that one with this one. It's not really the best example for sourcing here. And the purpose of the chart really, was it created to demonstrate that, or is it created to simply report the story of that? So I think the first two situation especially is a lot easier one to use with a graph like this. As Ms. Farr mentioned, you'd probably talk about the 1824 election being the corrupt bargain election. The 1828 election is Jackson's first victory. Notice there's more than double the voter participation in that election. And then it even goes up even further, up to the 80 in 1840. So you're kind of almost annotating the graph if you're putting it in its proper situation and identifying some of those things in there. So.
Hey, and don't forget, you guys, please go ahead and shout out your teachers. Use that Google form that we get so we can go ahead and put their name at the end of our presentation. So we still got some teacher, this is still Teacher Appreciation Week, and we really want your teachers to know that you love them. And I know I've gotten over 150 of them so far, so that is wonderful. So please, please, please go to the Google Doc and fill that out for them, so that they know that they are loved and appreciated. Just in case they miss us saying it, they can actually see it there.
Yeah, a couple students on Twitter. How many changes do you recommend for picking for FRQ practice number 2? I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more towards the end, but you might have to, slim this down a little bit. Remember, you can. If you use just 2 documents, you can really focus on just 2 different things there for that. And then another student asked, if after we do this HIP analysis, after referencing the document or quote, how do we tie it back to our thesis? And that's a great question. So, for example, if you're making the argument that, especially for white males, one of the big cultural changes of the period is that more and more of them had access to the political process, you would cite this document as proof that that's what's happening. So instead of saying you can see in the chart 1824, 26.9% of the people voted, you would use that to support this idea that this is a big change for at least for white males. Remember, women, of course, were excluded from this. African Americans were excluded from this. Native Americans were excluded from this. But so use it to support your argument. Don't just cite what you see in the document. So.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to our last document, Frederick Douglass speech that happened. And if you know anything about Frederick Douglass or a little bit of background, remember Frederick Douglass was a actual runaway slave pretty much for all of his life. He was never actually granted his freedom. He's probably one of the most famous in the fact that he really dedicated his life to fighting for the abolition of slavery. And he also supported some women's causes. He actually did give a lot of advice and kind of was considered to be very, very regal individual. And a lot of people looked up to him because he actually was very scholarly. And so the thing about this speech I wanted to kind of mention is that he was actually invited to give this speech on July 4th. However, he did not give it until July 5th because of his feelings about the July 4th and how it did not mean the same thing for those who were born into slavery as it meant for everybody else. So that kind of goes into the historical situation. This is an event commemorating the signing of the Declaration of Independence that was held by Rochester's Corinthian Hall. The intended audience at this time, he was invited by the ladies of the Anti-Slavery Society, which is why he actually made this speech. But again, he did change his mind. One of the things he told them is that while he would love to make this speech because he was supportive of, the abolitionists, and he was also supportive of women's suffrage, he did not feel that he did not feel that it'd be in his best interest to make the speech on the day that they wanted him to make it on. So he made it actually on July 5th.
Okay, and the point of view, he's pointing out that for a slave, the 4th of July makes a mockery of the whole idea of democracy and liberty and freedom and personal rights, because, of course, for slaves, they don't have any of that. And he's kind of making the point that this kind of rubs salt in the wound, really, by celebrating, oh, isn't this great that America is a country of freedom and liberty, and yet you're denying that freedom and liberty to a whole race of people. The purpose is to advocate for anti-slavery, to convince Americans of the cruelty of slavery, to point out the hypocrisy of celebrating a country that was founded on Enlightenment ideals, and yet at the same time maintaining the institution of slavery. So.
Okay. So I think we got a couple of questions on Twitter
I'm
that
trying to
just
answer them, but
popped up. Right. I think one of them is, after we do this HIP analysis after referencing the document or the quote, how do we tie it back? Okay, I think you already answered that one.
yeah.
Here's another one. It says, is it okay that a lot of my information from my contextualization paragraph is also my body paragraphs? What needs to be different information in my body paragraphs, or is it as long as I expand on my context?
I actually just responded to that one.
Mhm.
But a simple answer is your context should really be background and not be the main focus of the essay.
Okay.
Um,
Had another question about, can you look up events online during the exam? I wouldn't recommend that. Remember, you have 45 minutes. And so spending time doing something like that can actually backfire on you. Remember, we have given you several notes. I'm pretty sure your teachers have given you lots of notes. You can definitely reference back to the cram packet that we provided at the beginning from period 1. If you need me to repost that, I can do that once we get done. We also gave you the ABCs. So those are several things that you have at your disposal in addition to whatever notes that you do. But you're taking a chance by doing something like that. And keep in mind that they do have software that can detect. So I would be very leery of things that you get offline, copying them down verbatim, because that is considered plagiarism and it can get your score canceled. So this is, again, your own thoughts. So don't try to stress out so much and trying to make a perfect score. I think this is what I'm kind of getting from a lot of the questions. You guys just need to focus in on answering the question as effectively and as best as you can. Remember, you guys are teenagers. They're not gonna expect you to know something that historians have been studying all of their lives for. So don't feel like you need to sound like a historian who's been looking at this information for the last 20 years. Okay.
Yeah. Another one is, how do you tie all these ideas together? And so you want to think about, what's the question asking? How much changed? So maybe I do a paragraph that says, for these folks, a lot of things changed. And then for these folks, not a lot of things changed. So might be one way to sort of tie this together. Or you could tie it together by talking about the different reform movements of the period. So, the women's rights movement, for example, the abolition movement, which connects back to document 5 here, which are both really fueled by the first document. So that's tying sort of 3 of them in. Another student asked, do we have to do all the parts of HIP? And we talked about this yesterday, but just to reiterate, these are 4 different possible answers for document 5 that you see on the screen here. You do not have to have all 4 of them. Any one of those is sufficient. So as long as it's tied into your essay correctly. So please don't think that you have to have HIPP for each of the documents that you're sourcing. Any one of those is just fine.
Okay. We have another question that says, does Madison's work count as contextualization point? How does it tie to your argument? Remember, when you're doing contextualization, it all goes back to your thesis. It all goes back to your argument and how you're answering the question. Please don't just throw information in there just to throw it in there. It needs to all make sense. It's kind of like you're talking about this and all of a sudden you decide to mention, oh yeah, and in 1776, they signed the Declaration of Independence. And you're thinking, oh, that's contextualization. That's outside information. I just threw that in there. It doesn't make sense. So it needs to basically make sense to you, and it needs to make sense to the reader. I often tell students this: think about this paper as you are teaching someone who does not know a single bit of English and you're trying to tell them something about American history. How would you do this in the simplest form? And that's how you got to make this. Don't make this any more difficult than it has to be. Okay. All right. So we talked about arguments and kind of talked about things that you should have gotten. So these are kind of remembering what you should have referenced from there. So from document 1, that was the Second Great Awakening. Number 2 was talking about the Indian Removal Act. 3 was talking about the changes for women. Document 4 was talking about the change in voter patterns. And document 5 was addressing African Americans. So looking at all of this and kind of thinking about it, basically what they're looking at are reform movements as well as changes in voter patterns. That was something that you could have gotten from all of this from periods 1820 to 1860. So when you're talking about your outside information or contextualization, make sure you stay within that time period when you're bringing in that information. That is very, very important. Something that's definitely could have mentioned, you could have talked about how all of this possibly will give rise to sectionalism. You could talk about how it will eventually lead to, as you know, America was extending out west, how the changes, especially for African Americans, how that's going to change and have an impact as well. So there's so many ways that you guys can tie this into it that, again, kind of think about the time period, which is why we always recommend brainstorming before you start writing, because that can kind of help you collect your thoughts. Anything you want to add to that, Mr. Horton?
No, that's perfect. So again, like we talked about with the first one, if this was me taking this, I would just scribble down a quick list of, okay, here's the docs I have. Now, how am I going to start putting this together into some kind of an argument? So
Okay.
shout out to Mr. Markham from Panther Creek High School. Another shout out to Ms. Farr and I. So thank you again for that. Here's the other one. Mr. Van Tassel and Mrs. Marshall from Winston Churchill High School, and Mrs. Hake from Dublin High School.
All right. Had a question again, says, if we did 3 body paragraphs, would 1 introduction and 2 body be good? Yeah, if you are able to make sure that you're hitting all points of your rubric. So if it tells you to address 4 documents, you can address 4 documents in 2 body paragraphs. If it tells you to analyze 2, you need to make sure that you do the analysis. And of course, you need to make sure that you're doing that bottom part, which we're going to kind of talk about right now. So there are many different ways that you can kind of do that. So don't feel like you have to write like 6 or 7 paragraphs. Sometimes 4 paragraphs might be all you can get into it. But again, just kind of, again, make sure that it flows, that it all kind of goes back to what your original thesis statement is, which is what your argument. Some outside pieces of information. Mr. Horton, I'm gonna let you take this one.
Okay, great. So, so these are some other social changes that happened in the period that you could have cited or included somehow in the essay to talk about. So, transcendentalism, the development of this American idea that's sort of a blend of romanticism from Europe. If you studied that in any detail at all, Henry David Thoreau, of course, and Ralph Waldo Emerson are the two main folks from that. The Hudson River School of Painters, as Americans begin to develop their own unique style of art. So people begin painting landscapes. So you have Cole is one of the main painters of that Hudson School. One group that's definitely not in the documents is immigrants. So if you could talk about how immigrants changed the United States socially. So in this time period that we're talking about, it's mostly Germans and Irish, especially the Irish lead to this nativist reaction against them. You have the formation of the Know Nothing Party, which is dedicated to preventing these immigrants from having any influence on the political system. Those are some really good social changes that are not referenced at all in the document. The temperance movement and all these other reform movements that grew out of the Second Great Awakening, like the education movement with Horace Mann, or protecting the mentally ill with Dorothea Dix, or you might remember Sylvester Graham from the diet reform. These are all other social changes that are happening in that period that are really not connected at all to the document. So as Ms. Farr mentioned, your outside info should be in the time period just to make sure that you get credit for that. I mean, that's an important part of this. So and then again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's lots of other possible answers of outside information that are not here. So this is just sort of a brainstorm list that I created. So.
Okay, here's a good question. Someone asked, are we guaranteed one picture or graph in our 5 documents? We have no clue what the test development committee will pick. We just know that you will have some form of a stimuli, whether it be a primary source, a secondary source, it could be a graph, it could be a photo, a picture, it can be a political cartoon. But we have gotten you guys, we've given you pretty much all the types of examples that you could possibly get. So I think you guys are really well prepared. So again, another great question was, making sure, how do I, remain calm about this? Just relax. You got this. And remember, it's a rough draft. There's no such thing as a perfect DBQ that everything is going to be perfect. You just need to make sure that you answer your prompt, that you are touching all parts of your rubric that they're giving you, and just know that you got this. And the biggest thing is when you log into that test, just know, just the first thing you say to yourself is, I got this. You are your biggest advocate. So if you guys believe that you have this, then you will be awesome. So I'm not even worried about it, because I can tell that we have so many smart individuals who have been with us this entire time that I think you guys are going to really rock it out. I can't wait to read your essays this summer when we go to grade.
Yeah, attitude is everything, right?
Right. Just a quick reminder about the themes. We've talked about this, we've hit on this before, but there were multiple themes that you guys, we hit on here. We talked about theme 5, definitely with politics and power. I know there was a touching a little bit about theme 7, American and regional culture. And also, is there anything else we could think of that was also in here, Mr. Horton? Those two kind of stand out in my head right now.
Yeah, maybe theme 8 a little bit, but so the reason we remind you of this is when you go to the complexity piece. I know a couple of students early on asked about, well, how do I do complexity in my essay? Is to think about what evidence in other themes support what we're talking about. So this question, I think it's on the next slide. This question is all about social things or cultural things. So can we think of other ways that people would have been impacted in that period? So politics and power is another theme that we could talk about. So what political changes are happening in the period? And we actually, there's a one document in there that kind of gives you a hint on that with the Jackson the percentage of voting folks that are there. America in the world, what's going on with America's role in the world? Somebody asked about, could we use the War of 1812 as a contextualization point? Sure, that's what's happening just before this. And as long as you, again, tie that into the culture piece of that America is going to come out of that war feeling that they really need to define what it is to be an American, and to be separate from Britain. Work exchange technology, what were economic changes in the period? And it sort of hints at that. We talked about the market revolution at the beginning, things like roads and canals, and the telegraph is created in that time period, and you have the beginnings of the factory system. And so, are those things that are also changing things for people? So that's corroborating the essay. Another way to earn a complexity point is to either modify or qualify your question, and we kind of talked about that a little bit before. So, if you had a paragraph that said, "Look, a lot of things changed for this group of people, but things really didn't change all that much for this group of people," you're qualifying your answer. I often think of this as the gray area. Can you explain that there's a gray area here? It's not just, oh, everything changed for everybody in the time period. For some people it did, and for some people it didn't. It might be one way of doing that. And then nuances, do you sort of understand the different shades of meaning that are here? So, for example, for this group of people, a lot of things change. For this group of people, very few things change. And for this group of people, nothing changed might be one way to think about this complexity.
Okay. So, really quickly before we sign off, thank you for everyone for all of your questions and everything that you have done. We really do appreciate it, and we're glad to know that you guys are listening and appreciative of everything. I'm kind of sad that this is going to be our almost last day. We have one more day with you guys, and we definitely want you guys to come and join us tomorrow as we kind of give you some last minute tips. And there are some very special people who have something they would like to say to you. But I have these teachers posted up there. This was from the Google Doc, and I know somebody just asked me, where's the Google Doc? I'm going to put it back up there once we are done. But hey, all of these teachers are doing something awesome and phenomenal. Their kids love them, and so we just wanted to kind of give them, so everybody know that, hey, your kids are thinking about you. And so hopefully your teacher, you can let them know if you see their name up here. Remember, we've been doing this for a couple of days, so some of the names, if you don't see it up here, it may have been up there on Tuesday. And then we have one more day that we're going to cover. So if you haven't got a chance to give your teacher, show your teacher some appreciation this week, when I post the Google form back up there, please make sure you do that so that they know that they are loved. But again, we want to say thank you. These are our colleagues. And I also want to give a teacher appreciation shout out to all of my colleagues at my school at Cambridge High School. I know that this has been a very difficult time with the teleschooling and everything that's been happening within our county, and you guys have been awesome. And I know that especially Mr. Bordis and Ms. Hall, I just want to say thank you guys. They're the A+ teachers there at my school, and so I just really want to say thank you for them. Mr. Horton, you want to give anybody a shout out as well?
Definitely you. I think it's been really a great, seriously, it's been a great adventure, kind of working our way through this. And really to all the teachers, as you mentioned, being Teacher Appreciation Week, and more so than any other year, I think a lot of people are beginning to realize just exactly what it is that education is and what it isn't through this whole online thing. So we're really glad to be a part of your preparation for the exam. I'm glad that I was asked to do it, and it's been a great experience for me. And we look forward to you tuning in tomorrow, because we definitely have a very special guest for you tomorrow. And we're going to give you some last minute tips for the test, and wish you well. So.
Yeah. And so, and again, I forgot, I didn't mean to leave you off, Mr. Horton. Definitely say thank you for you. So really quickly before we leave you guys, and I'll come back up so you can actually see that I'm still here. These are some important links that you can have. We've given them to you before. We want to just make sure that you get them again. So if you haven't had a chance to go to the demo site, please go to it, practice uploading. That's going to be very, very important. We asked you guys to make sure to read the video of, walking through the exam, just kind of making sure that you know what to do, what the expectation is, and basically talk about the rules. All right, and this is my dog, who you can see appearing in the screen right here.
Somebody asked that question about, how do you de-stress a little bit for the exam? This is one way to do that. Do that AP demo, watch that 5 steps, walkthrough video. So that way you have, you know that part of it, like, here's what I'm going to be doing on that day. So you can focus on just dealing with the question instead of this other thing sort of floating out there.
Yeah. And like I said, I think you guys got this. My dog has been here with you guys learning A push as well. So I'm kind of tempted to see if she can actually take the AP exam, see how she might do. All right, guys. Well, this is it for us for today. We will see you tomorrow. And we will answer a few more of your questions on Twitter, and try to get as many of them that we possibly can. But as always, thank you guys and have a great day.
Yep. Thanks. See you guys.